Hello, everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. I'm Kenneth Amaduri, and I'm joined today with a brand new guest here at Crush the Street, someone who's an expert on history of the Great Depression, and really what's going on behind the scenes leading up to it. Was it pre-planned manipulation? Somebody pulling strings behind the scenes? Was the Great Depression a function of free market, or was it controlled Keynesian, loose monetary policies, and really something sinister, more behind the scenes, underneath the surface that the mainstream media is not talking about? So to discuss this and more with us today, we have Wayne Jett on the line with us. His website is classicalcapital.com. And, I think after this conversation we have here, you'll get a really good idea of what sort of information he has to offer. He's an author. His latest book is The Fruits of Graft. And let's get into it. The Great Depression. Wayne Jett, thanks for coming on Crush the Street with me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and I can't wait to tell you some more about the Great Depression and what led up to it, all that sort of thing. I might just say in beginning, I'll state the conclusions first. That's not the way I approach it in my book. I present all the historical facts, the years, the centuries leading up to the Great Depression, what our country had experienced. We have been mercantilist, not capitalist, since our founding. We are most certainly a mercantilist society today. Every aspect of our society, starting with finance, but going throughout our popular media, the government, so-called government institutions, all of those are mercantilist. That is, mercantilism was the name given to the so-called kingmaker approach to society, where the wealthiest, what has really been the global cabal, as we call it now, for centuries, has ruled from behind the scenes. They've picked the kings in the old monarchies, told them what to do, and expanded their fortunes that way. Have always done whatever they could. But let's bring that into the closer to here and now and the Great Depression. Yes, it was pre-planned. Yes, it was done on purpose. It was not done by the Fed. That was a false confession that Ben Bernanke made when he was chairman of the Fed. It was not the Fed that was the laboring oar in causing the Great Depression. It was primarily the two presidents and the Congress, as well as others private behind the scenes. But let me tell you how it got going. I'll tell you the pre-planning later. There was plenty of evidence at the time that many important people knew about the Great Depression, made great profits. For example, the largest shareholder in Chase Bank at that time, which was the largest bank of the country, the chairman and CEO was the largest shareholder. He sold short against the box. He owned a lot of shares. He sold a large portion of his shares short in September of 1929, and covered that short against the box. In other words, bought back the stock at the low at the beginning of November, right after the Great Depression, Great Crash of 1929. So he was not the only one. There were numerous insiders who were in on the pre-planning and exactly how it went down. But let me get to the actions of the presidents that really put the Great Depression into full swing. Yes, the crash itself was pre-planned, and what I've determined to have been the signal for the beginning of the crash, the inside cabal and those working with them were given the signal that when there were votes taken on the floor of the Senate to pass the Smoot-Hawley tax bill, that is to cut or raise tariffs very substantially on any key commodity product, industrial products. When those votes were taken, that's exactly the moment at which the crash on that day began. That was in October of 1929. And the way the crash was made to happen is when that signal happened, they did what was called watering stock there. They sold stock short, shares they didn't own, shares they didn't deliver, but they did it in millions of shares of substantially everything on the New York Stock Exchange and anything else otherwise as well. Selling all of those millions of fake shares, the price is guaranteed to crash. And so asset crashed very substantially, as we know, in those 5 days of the crash. They would buy it back at the bottom, cover their shorts, and then ride it back up, and then do it again. Those are the 5 days. That's the way that was orchestrated. Okay, Hoover certainly was aware that the people involved in the financial markets is widely believed that it was a manipulated crash, but he did absolutely nothing to stop it. That was one of his great wrongs. Finally, in 1932, he suggested maybe the Senate should have hearings on the cause of the crash. And they had those hearings, and it started revealing this fraud, including, for example, the Chase banker selling short ahead of time and then covering after the destruction was over. There was plenty of other evidence as well, and it made Hoover extremely unpopular because he had done nothing to stop it. It had continued with that kind of what we call naked short selling today. They were doing it then, but with papers without computers. And that continued all the term of Hoover, and he did nothing about it. He also did a second very bad thing, which was allow Smoot-Hawley to pass, even signed it into law, when he could have stopped it in a second. He could have stopped it with a word. He could have stopped it by veto for certain. It only passed by 3 votes in the Senate. So in that circumstance, he knew it was wrong. It shut down U.S. imports and exports by 70% within 18 months. So it was devastating to U.S. production and exporting, and there was no reason to do it in terms of raising imports, raising tariffs, because we had a substantial positive current account balance. That is, we were selling more abroad than we were buying from abroad. So why shut down world trade? Clearly, it was done as another move toward putting the economy in depression. So that was the second.
Wayne, let me jump in there. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, 9,000 banks failed during the months leading up to the Great Depression. We saw the massive stock market crash, and I know you're talking a lot about how this happened.
Okay, let me get a little bit further, and you'll see the connection. I'm quite sure.
Let's talk about it.
The third big wrong was in 1932 when he's running for re-election. Hoover, who had won in a landslide because of Coolidge's tremendous economic record, proposed a massive tax increase, and the Democrats who had taken over the House passed it for him. He signed it into law, and without any withholding tax, they made it retroactive to January 1 of 32. A quadrupling of the lowest bracket and a tripling of the highest bracket. And there was no withholding. It was all due on March 15th of the next year, 1933, which was the time of the run on the bank, so-called. People were having to withdraw their money to pay these monstrous tax increases. And of course, they ushered him out of town on a rail with that kind of a record. He had double-crossed the people that had elected him, certainly killing the middle class, and got the Depression going. By the time he left office, actually at the end of 31, unemployment was at 25%. And so Roosevelt rode into office in a landslide, and it was really to undo those 3 things. And he did the opposite.
Roosevelt raised taxes and added new taxes every year he was in office, except one year, 1939, when in the off-year elections of 38, the Democrats had lost 83 seats, still a record in the House, because it was then regarded as the Roosevelt Depression, not the Hoover Depression. Let me tell you what else Roosevelt did. He was really the active oar. I found other evidence later. I didn't know it at the time I was reporting all this, but saying that he was an active operative of the global cabal that controlled him. He was so trusted that they even gave him his head on how to explain and how to do things. But let me tell you the major things that he started doing. I've already told you that he raised taxes every year he was office in the 4 terms, except 39. One of the major things that he did was, as soon as he took office, of course, he confiscated the gold. He required all the gold owned by the people who had to liquidate after the crash of 29. They had to sell factories at cents on the dollar. Whatever capital they had, they put into gold because he was rumoring that he was going to devalue. And so in that circumstance, they had the gold they had paid $20.67 an ounce for. He immediately ordered they turn it all in, and he paid them back exactly what they paid for it, $20.67. As soon as he got the gold, then he did the devaluation, took all the profits, about 70% profit on that write-up of the price, and he put it in a secret fund that is still today called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, secretly operated, never an assistance to it's just given a false name to make it appear it's doing something beneficial, but it has no supervision of the government whatsoever. In that circumstance, he had all the gold in. The only ones that could buy it were overseas banks when they wanted to change their dollars for gold. He sold it to them at $35 an ounce when he had bought. The other thing that was overriding in importance is he immediately began buying gold on foreign exchange for the U.S. Treasury. He took money from the tax revenues. Instead of feeding the people who were starving to death by then, he took the tax revenues and he borrowed more in bond money and spent it on buying gold on foreign exchange. That was ripping currency money out of the U.S. economy and putting it into gold. And most importantly, he ordered that the gold not be monetized as was required by the gold standard. The gold standard rule was every country with gold, you monetize it fully so that your people will have enough money to buy goods from other countries. That was the mutual deal for mutual benefit. But he very carefully made certain that he did not monetize any gold that he bought. And listen to this, even with the tremendous growth of the first 30 years of the 20th century, our average growth in GDP at that time for 1900 to 1930 was something almost 10% a year, unheard of today. And yet, as of 1930, we had a little over 6,000 metric tons of gold in the U.S. Treasury. Now, that was a much increase over 1900 because we were adding gold every year, but we had about 6,000 tons. In his first 2 terms in office, between 1933 and 1940, he bought over 13,000 tons of gold using U.S. money, taking it out of the economy, putting in gold, and refusing to allow any of it to be monetized. That's why assets were selling for 3 to 5 cents on the dollar. That's why J. Paul Getty said that he got his so-called biggest fortune in the world. It wasn't, but he was certainly extremely wealthy by any measure because he could buy oil any place in the world for 2 to 5 cents on the dollar. Assets in the ground for that kind of price.
Wow.
And that's the way it was for all of the global elite during that period of time. And Roosevelt was one of them.
Well, it definitely goes to show why there's a lot of animosity towards elite, because of the advantage or whatever you want to call it, the taking advantage of the systems that they're able to do because of the position of power that they're in. Now, I'm no socialist or I'm no believer in socialist policies, communism, but I understand the frustration that comes from a lot of these narratives that promote, like a Green New Deal or something like Bernie Sanders wants to come out and really go after the top 1% and keep them from controlling the rest of the 99%. And it lends itself to some of what you're saying there. But I just want to leave you with this, and you'll be able to respond to all of that. Herbert Hoover predicted that the United States would soon see a day when poverty was eliminated. I mean, how does that even correlate or mesh, or does it not at all with all of the findings that you've been able to uncover?
My view of Hoover is that he basically rolled over for those who control the Republican Party as they control the Democrat Party. Both parties, as they are today, or have been up until the election of Trump, are controlled by that same global cabal. It was true then. In 1933, shortly after his election, Franklin Roosevelt, wrote a letter to Edward M. House, the guy who had been the Wall Street handler of Woodrow Wilson during his 2 terms, wrote him a letter saying, "You and I both know the truth is that every administration since Andrew Jackson in this country, that was ended in 1832, has been owned by the financial sector of a certain portion of this country." And not only that, he said in that same letter, the following line was, and today we're involved in the same kind of fight that Andrew Jackson was involved in, except on a much broader front. Let me interpret that for you. He's saying it's involved on a much greater front now because the president is on the side of the ruling elite, not like Jackson was on the side of the people, who was fighting the central bank and actually ended it. That's the comment in a personal private letter between Franklin Roosevelt and E.M. House in 1933. If that's not a confession, I'd like to have a chance at trial to show exactly the kind of animus, the direct attack on the American people that FDR was fronting and actively involved in making happen. It wasn't certainly his doing. He was following orders, but he was doing it so well. That's why the evidence is that he became such a trusted operative that they even gave him his head on a number of the things that he did. May I tell you some more of the things that he did? That gold purchase alone would have been enough to absolutely devastate the economy because it was such a severe deflation that he caused. But as soon as he got control of the Federal Reserve by a Reform Act in 1935, he had new appointments on the governorship of the Fed. And in order to make it appear that he was taking control, the first thing they did in their first meeting in August of 1936 with that new Fed is they raised the reserve requirements for banks by 50%. Now, there were no banks in trouble at that time. Of course, all the small banks, all the regional and area banks are all the enemies of the Wall Street banks. They want them all gone. Raising the reserve requirements, essentially, he did it in August 36, and immediately there were foreclosings because all those banks had to cut their loans, even if they were performing, because they had to meet these new reserve requirements. As soon as he was reelected, Roosevelt then in the January of 37 raised it again by another third. So in those 2 actions, within 6 months, they increased the reserve requirements double. on banks around the country. They were foreclosing farmers. They were foreclosing homes. People were put on the street, having to migrate, looking for work and a place to live for no reason other than simply to starve them to death and to make them as destitute as possible. And I'm telling you, by the manifesto that I found, published in 1901, that immediately got the writer, the author of the manifesto for the global elite, an invitation as the honored guest of Theodore Roosevelt's White House, explained in detail what their plan was. It was to destroy the middle class completely, worldwide, especially in the United States. The middle class being defined as any and every person able to support himself and his family by his own labor. Wow. At whatever level, rich or poor, if they can support themselves, they're gone. They want them eliminated. They said we need to learn by 2000 how to poison them all, because all we want left are ourselves as rulers and our servants, two classes. That stable system that has always served us so well.
Wow.
Has been this over the centuries. That man was honored the world over. He was invited to the palaces in Europe. He was invited to Stalin's Moscow as his honored guest. He had admiring statements. That was H.G. Wells, the Englishman, who up to that time had been unknown, but as of 1901, he became practically a revered academic. And that little book spelled it all out, including the people of the abyss who were to be exterminated, described in terms of black, brown, yellow, dirty-skinned whites, Jews. Those were to be exterminated because they are not wanted.
My goodness.
Now, this is the kind of thing that obviously would have a person driven from society today if he even survived. And yet, this was the man who was invited back to FDR's White House on multiple occasions for extended stays of 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And he had nothing but praise. He said that, for example, FDR's kitchen cabinet, his closest advisors, were truly the men of the American Republic, men of the new republic, that are able to take full power when the time comes.
It's amazing how FDR was such a glorified figure in our mainstream,
Not just was, is.
He is, right? He's this, even a lot of Republicans will say, I'm more of a FDR Democrat, or you know what I'm saying? Like they say, well, I'm not a typical Democrat. Right. I'm an FDR Democrat,
Well, let me tell you about the academics. After my book came out in 2011, revealing all of this, about 2 years later, I'm not even sure that the man even knew about my book at the time he wrote, but he writes another book called Traitor to His Class, again making the argument that FDR was a traitor to the elite that he was born and raised and lived in and absolutely expounded privately his entire life. And yet they still keep up this completely false facade. And of course, the author of that book was hired away from a professorship in Arizona to the University of Texas, full professorship in history. Now that is the kind of thing spelled out in the plan, written by H.G. Wells and published in 1901, in which publishers are to be controlled. A network of central banks is to control all currency. A graduated income tax is to be put into effect. That taxes what? Earned income. That is the hallmark of the middle class, the person who works. It is to have tax-exempt foundations and trusts, they call them, such as the great ones, to protect the wealth of the ruling elite against any taxation. And if you think that the IRS is capable of attacking the Tea Parties when they form some kind of tax-exempt organization, you can be certain that the ruling elite's foundations never get touched. They have no problem with doing whatever they want. Look at the situation of the previous 2016 presidential candidate who has a foundation that has collected billions in charitable donations, so-called, that has never even been looked at. And
Right.
to my knowledge, according to the best expert on it, has never even applied for tax-exempt status. Okay.
You know, one thing I'll mention here, Wayne, and I think is interesting, you know, for the average business, the middle class, if you will, living in New York, living in California, you know, these are places that I'm very familiar with. I grew up there. I've seen what's happened to the millennial generation, seen what happened to my peers, you know, getting crushed by these policies. The middle class is struggles in these areas. And you would think that in areas like this, the wealthy would be hurt the most, but it's almost like the wealthy that live in Malibu and, you know, just different parts of, you know, the nicest areas in California or, you know, Manhattan would be suffering from these policies. But it's almost like they have a special VIP ticket in these areas where they're able to thrive, while the middle class, you know, can't live there. It's just the servants and the elites in so many ways. So maybe comment on that, if you will, and kind of, you know, where we are today as we close out this interview.
Well, certainly today, you can look at what's happening in California. The elites have it by the throat. They're driving ordinary people out of the state. They're burning their homes down. They're burning forests. They're doing that in such a way as to clear human beings from parts of the country that they don't want human occupation. They're doing it with technology that is absolutely horrible in terms of both the killing people who are not reported in many much greater numbers than have been told in the media, and with one aspect of that I must mention, because it is so devastating, is what's called geoengineering. There's a technology involving at least 300 patents, which essentially create a weapon to be used in the atmosphere. It's an anti-personnel weapon, much in the way of radiation, but geoengineering technology sprays micron size, that's a billion within an inch, particles, so small. They spray them into the atmosphere, metals of aluminum, strontium, and barium primarily. And they suspend them in the atmosphere in what's called aerosols to make them look like clouds and to hold them up as long as possible. And they magnetize those with electronic radiation. Those are having absolutely devastating effects on weather. They can stop the rain. They can make flooding. They can cause winters. They can cause absolutely the most arid deserts and hot spells you can imagine. They can heat the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, to 15,000 degrees with radiation. And if you think that doesn't create a high pressure area, then you haven't thought enough about what the weather conditions are. Those are able to turn the normal air currents, the jet streams that we've heard about for years, and make them go wherever they want. They can divert them. They can divert the rain from Northern California, as they did for years. They can put the floods into the Midwest. All of that is now conducted not just against the United States, but against a worldwide scope. And it's got to be stopped. It is killing insects. It's killing the bees. It's killing our production. It coats the forests with metallic coats around the trees that make them explode into flames when they're heated in the right way. That has got to be stopped. It is a tremendous health hazard because it is the primary cause, for example, of the diseases in youth, the autism, which I just heard an expert medical researcher on that, researched it for many years. He says that within the next 10 years, every male child is going to be autistic at birth because of the effects of this aluminum and metals in the reproductive processes and so forth. So right now, the ruling elite still has power, but I believe I'm much more optimistic than when my book was published in 2011, that we have a president finally who was put into office with protection of our military so that he can't be assassinated. There have been many attempts at assassination which have not been reported, and they've successfully protected him. Every other president that has been elected by the people outside of the global elite has been murdered in one way or another. There we are.
Well, we will have the links in the description area to your website, Mr. Wayne Jett, everyone. I definitely want to get into more of the details on geoengineering and some of the other topics that you cover. But that's all we have time for today. I appreciate your expertise coming on Crush the Street. If people want to learn more about your website, what you do, please let them know where they can go and what they can expect to find.
Classicalcapital.com is the name. I call it Classical Capital because I'm a classical economist, having added that on to my work for most of my career as a lawyer in California. I litigate a lot of cases in the Ninth Circuit and a couple in the, a number in the Supreme Court, a couple of decisions. But nevertheless, classicalcapital.com, my book, The Fruits of Graft, is much more explicit, is fully referenced. I went through the diaries of the Secretary of the Treasury for Roosevelt and got much of the information and the insights from his personal daily diary that was edited by him with his help and published by a Yale historian. All of my citations are in there, and it's much better expressed than I can be in a short interview. But it's $25 and available only on my website. I'm sorry, except it is electronically available on Amazon, on the Kindle version. So,
all right. Well, definitely check that out, and we'll be sure to have you on again for a follow-up to discuss some of the other topics in greater detail. So, Wayne Jett, everyone, thanks for coming on Crush the Street with me.
I'm happy to be here, Kenneth. Thanks for inviting me.